The walls of a medieval peasant's home were never meant to keep the cold out. They were built from mud and straw, patched together with whatever scraps could be found, and in winter they became little more than thin skins against an endless, biting wind. Inside, there was no insulation, no glass in the windows, just wooden shutters that rattled and groaned, letting in streams of icy air that slid across the floor and up the spine like a ghost's hand. At night, the wind didn't howl outside. It moved through the house, creeping over sleeping bodies, chilling the breath in their lungs. You could wrap yourself in every rag you owned and still feel that sharp, aching cold pressing against your bones. The roof was another enemy. Thatched reeds might keep out the rain in summer, but in winter they sagged heavy with frost, dripping icy water into the corners, sometimes directly onto the bedding. The floor was just hard-packed earth, and the frost seeped up through it like a slow poison, numbing toes even before you lay down. If you were unlucky enough to have a gap in the wall or a loose plank, the wind would whistle through all night long, making the flames in the small hearth tremble and threatening to snuff them out entirely. In such conditions, warmth wasn't just comfort, it was survival, and survival meant constant vigilance. Before night fell, someone had to check the walls for new cracks, push rags or straw into the holes, and weigh down the shutters with whatever heavy objects could be found. But these efforts were small victories against an overwhelming enemy. No matter how much you tried to block it out, the cold always found its way in. It slid under doors, through keyholes, between the seams of poorly joined wood. Even a single breath could crystallize in the air, a reminder of how hostile the night really was. If you're enjoying this journey into the past, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. It really helps bring more stories like this to life. And tell me in the comments, what time is it right now where you are and where in the world are you watching from? What made it worse was that the cold didn't just stay in the air, it got into you. Once it settled deep in your muscles, in the marrow of your bones, there was no easy way to drive it out. People would wake in the night, shivering so violently their teeth rattled, unable to get warm again, no matter how tightly they pulled the blankets. A child's cough in the dark could send a spike of fear through the family because, in winter, a cough was rarely just a cough. It could be the start of something that took them away by morning. And yet, there was no choice but to endure it. A peasant's home wasn't built for luxury. It was built from necessity and desperation, with whatever the land could provide for free. Stones were too expensive, timber too precious, so mud and straw were the default. The walls were only as strong as the last repair, and in winter, repairs were rushed, done with numb fingers and short daylight hours. Every flaw became a doorway for the cold to creep in, and the cold was patient. It could wait, night after night, to claim someone too tired or too weak to resist. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, when the fire had burned too low and no one had the strength to tend it, the cold would become almost a living presence. People swore they could hear it in the timbers, feel it pressing against their skin like invisible fingers tracing their faces. In that silence, the only sound might be the slow, uneven breathing of those still asleep, wrapped in whatever scraps they could find. And beneath that stillness, there was always the question no one said out loud. Who would be the one not to wake up when the morning came? It was this silent, creeping danger that made every moment inside those fragile walls a battle. A battle not fought with swords or shields, but with rags stuffed into cracks, with desperate repairs in the freezing dusk, with the stubborn will to live through one more night. And when the sun finally broke through the cracks in the shutters, it wasn't just another day. It was a victory over an enemy you couldn't see, but could feel in every aching bone. That victory was fleeting, because the cold would return again, and the next night might be even harsher than the last. When the cold became unbearable, when no amount of patching the walls or sealing the shutters could keep the night from creeping in, peasants turned to the oldest and simplest weapon they had, each other's warmth. There was no thought of privacy or personal space. Survival demanded bodies pressed together in one tangled mass under whatever coverings could be found. Families would huddle in the same bed, children wedged between parents, grandparents tucked close to whoever could shield them best. Sometimes neighbors joined in, especially the elderly who lived alone, walking across frozen paths at dusk to sleep on another family's floor, wrapped in borrowed blankets. Even livestock, small goats or sheep, were sometimes allowed inside for the night, not out of affection, but because their body heat could mean the difference between shivering until dawn or slipping quietly into death. The smell was overwhelming, unwashed bodies, damp wool, the musk of animals, but no one cared. The point was to share warmth, to create a living barrier against the cold that seeped in from every crack. And yet, even in this closeness, there was always the edge of fear. A child who began to shiver too violently, or an elder whose breath grew faint, could draw tense glances in the dark. They knew the cold could claim someone without warning, and there was nothing to do but hold them tighter, as if human touch alone could keep them here until morning. Blankets were rarely the soft, woven kind you might imagine. Most were made from coarse, scratchy wool that had been used for years, repaired with patches, and stuffed with straw to make them heavier. That straw was a double-edged sword. Its insulation trapped heat, but it also harbored fleas, lice, and bedbugs, In the darkness, you could feel the tiny movements of insects in the fabric, hear the faint rustle when you shifted. Bites were constant, leaving red welts that itched day and night. Some peasants would shake out the bedding every morning, watching a scatter of fleas leap away. But by evening they'd return, hidden deep in the fibers. The straw bedding beneath the blankets was little better. It flattened quickly, becoming lumpy and uncomfortable, and in damp weather it reeked of mildew. If the fire's smoke couldn't dry it, the smell would cling to everything: your hair, your clothes, your skin. Sleeping wasn't about comfort. It was about finding a position where the cold couldn't reach the most vulnerable parts of your body, even if that meant waking up stiff and sore. People often went to sleep in the same clothes they'd worn all day, boots and all, because removing them meant losing precious body heat. A fire was the heart of any winter night, but in a peasant's home it was always a fragile heart, one that could fade too quickly. Wood was scarce and expensive, often gathered from fallen branches rather than cut trees. Families rationed their fuel carefully, burning just enough to keep the worst of the cold at bay, but not so much that the pile would run out before winter's end. The hearth would glow with a small flame, barely enough to light the room, and its warmth reached only those sitting directly beside it. If the fire went out in the night, someone would have to wake, shivering, to coax it back to life, a task made harder with numb fingers and fading embers. Many chose to risk sleeping through, knowing the cold would deepen, but unwilling to leave their fragile cocoon of warmth. The smoke from these fires was its own burden. Without chimneys in most peasant homes, the smoke would fill the single room, stinging eyes and coating the walls in black soot. Children coughed in their sleep, and the air tasted of ash. Some believed the smoke offered protection against insects and disease, but it also weakened the lungs over time. Yet no one dared complain. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant life. Better to breathe it in and endure the sting than let the flames die completely. Clothing was another layer of defense, but the poorest peasants had little more than coarse tunics, patched and worn thin, layered over whatever rags they could find. Wool was prized for its warmth, but it was scratchy and often infested with moth larvae that left tiny holes. In winter, these garments were rarely washed because wet clothes could freeze solid before they dried. The smell was strong, but keeping them dry meant keeping them usable. Mittens were often just scraps of cloth wrapped around hands, tied with string, and boots might be stuffed with straw to fill the gaps where leather had worn through. Each morning, these makeshift layers were pulled on again, stiff from the cold. And always there was the knowledge that warmth was temporary. Whatever heat you managed to trap would fade the moment you stepped away from the fire, the moment you let the blanket slip, the moment someone opened the door. It made every movement a calculation. Was it worth getting up to fetch more wood if it meant letting in a breath of icy air? Was it worth checking on the animals if it meant losing the fragile warmth you'd gathered? Every choice carried the risk of letting the cold win. Some peasants swore by tricks passed down for generations, sleeping with heated stones wrapped in cloth at the foot of the bed, lining the walls with sacks of grain to block drafts, or hanging wet rags over gaps to freeze and seal them. But each trick was just a small shield against a relentless enemy. The truth was, the cold didn't have to be deadly all at once. It could wear you down night after night until your body simply couldn't fight anymore. And when that moment came, the cold didn't roar or rage. It was quiet. It slipped in beside you like an old companion, and it stayed until you stopped moving. The survivors didn't speak of it openly, but they felt it in the mornings, in the silence that lingered too long in a corner of the room. And they knew, as they went about gathering wood and repairing the walls for another night, that the cold was waiting again, always waiting. And the next night might be the one where even the closest huddle wouldn't be enough. The blankets were never the soft, warm kind that could make a winter night feel bearable. In a peasant's home, they were more like heavy shields against death, stitched from whatever scraps of wool or rough linen could be found. Many were so worn that they seemed older than the people sleeping under them, their edges frayed, the fabric coarse enough to scrape the skin. To make them heavier and trap more heat, peasants stuffed them with straw, a simple trick that worked but came with an uninvited consequence. The straw crackled faintly when you shifted at night, and along with that sound came movement, tiny, living movement. Fleas and lice thrived in these makeshift covers. Once they found their way into the straw, they stayed for the season, biting relentlessly through the night. People would wake scratching at their necks, their wrists, their ankles, feeling the sting of fresh welts. The bites itched until they bled, and the bleeding attracted more insects. Some would try to fight them by shaking out the bedding in the morning, watching as a black speckled rain of fleas dropped onto the floor and scrambled away. Others burned handfuls of herbs over the fire, hoping the smoke would drive them out. But the pests always returned, carried back in with fresh straw or clinging to clothing. Even in the dead of winter, when the ground outside was frozen solid, the bedding was alive, and the straw itself was rarely fresh. It might be the same bundle used for months, its golden color faded to gray, damp from breath and sweat, and smelling faintly of mold. When the frost outside melted slightly, moisture crept inside the walls and into the bedding, turning it clammy to the touch. Lying down meant lying in a kind of damp warmth the kind that steamed faintly when the fire was going, but cooled into an almost unbearable chill once the flames died. It clung to the skin, making clothes and hair smell like rotting hay. You could feel it in your lungs too, that sour dampness with every breath you took before falling asleep. There was no real sense of ownership over these covers. Blankets and bedding were shared, passed down, and patched beyond recognition. If one family's blanket became too thin, they might stitch part of another into it, creating strange patchwork patterns of different fabrics and colors. Some were so heavy that it took effort just to pull them over your body, but the weight was part of the comfort. People believed that being pressed down by something substantial would help keep the heat in and the cold out, even if it left them waking up stiff and sore in the morning. Children often disappeared entirely under the bulk of these covers, their breath visible in tiny puffs from beneath the layers. Underneath it all, the bed wasn't really a bed. In most homes, it was simply a wooden frame, sometimes nothing more than a raised platform covered with another thick layer of straw. This layer flattened quickly under the weight of bodies, becoming uneven and full of hard lumps that pressed into your back and hips. When someone shifted in their sleep, the straw moved too, creaking softly like dry bones. If it wasn't replaced or fluffed often, it compacted into a mat as hard as the floor, and lying on it became its own form of discomfort. But replacing straw meant venturing outside to fetch it, and in the dead of winter, no one wanted to face the wind and snow unless it was absolutely necessary. It's hard to imagine now, but the act of going to bed was less about rest and more about bracing yourself for the long hours ahead. People didn't undress to sleep. They layered on as much clothing as they could, wrapping scarves around their heads, stuffing rags into the tops of their boots to keep toes from freezing. A mother might pull her child close, tucking the blanket so tightly around them both that they could barely move, the shared heat between them the only real defense against the night. The straw and the bedding would rustle, the fire would snap quietly in the hearth, and outside, the wind would scrape against the walls as if searching for a way in. Sometimes, the bedding itself became a kind of hidden hazard. Flea bites could become infected, the constant scratching breaking the skin and letting in dirt. In an era with little understanding of hygiene, a small wound could fester into something far more dangerous, and bedbugs, though smaller and quieter, were perhaps even more despised. They didn't just bite, they left behind a smell, a sickly sweet odor that lingered in the fabric. Once an infestation took hold, there was almost no way to get rid of it without burning the bedding entirely, which was a luxury few could afford. Most simply endured it because there was no alternative. And yet, despite all of this, the bites, the dampness, the smell, when the cold was at its worst, those blankets and straw mattresses were still the most precious things in the room. Without them, you were simply lying on the floor in an unheated space, exposed to a cold that could steal the breath from your lungs in minutes. People learned to ignore the itching, to live with the damp, to pretend the smell wasn't there. Because when the night deepened and the fire sank to embers, pulling that heavy, flea-ridden blanket up to your chin was still the only thing standing between you and the cold's silent reach. And somewhere in the dark, as the bedding rustled and the straw shifted under your weight, you might hear the faintest sound, a tiny scratching, the movement of something unseen. You'd pull the blanket tighter, pretending it was nothing, knowing that you couldn't risk throwing it off, not even for a moment, because the cold was waiting just beyond the edge of the covers, and it had all night to find its way in. Fire was the soul of the house in winter, but in a peasant's home it was never the roaring, comforting blaze you might imagine. It was small, fragile, and constantly threatened by the cold that pressed in from every side. The hearth was little more than a shallow pit or a crude stone platform with no proper chimney to guide the smoke upward. The flames flickered low, fed with bits of twigs, scavenged branches, and sometimes dried animal dung when wood was scarce. On a good night, the fire gave enough warmth to keep the frost from creeping into your bones, but never enough to make the air truly comfortable. You had to sit close, so close your skin felt the sting of heat, because just a few feet away, the air was already freezing. Wood was precious, too precious to waste. In deep winter, it wasn't unusual for a family to ration the fire like food. Each log had to last as long as possible, which meant keeping the flames low and feeding them only when necessary. Every addition of wood was a decision. Use it now for warmth and risk running out before the season ended, or endure the cold and save it for later. It was a cruel calculation, one made harder when children shivered under blankets, or the elderly coughed through the night. The gathering of fuel was a daily ordeal. Men, women, and even children would spend daylight hours searching for fallen branches in the forest or pulling up old roots from frozen ground. In some places, peasants risked cutting from the Lord's woods, knowing that if they were caught, the punishment could be severe. In times of scarcity, they burned anything that would catch, a broken stool, a piece of a cart, even scraps of clothing too worn to mend. But many of these makeshift fuels filled the room with thick, acrid smoke, making every breath a struggle. And still the cold was relentless, pressing closer as the night deepened. Without chimneys in most rural homes, the smoke had nowhere to go but out through small gaps in the roof or walls if it went anywhere at all. It hung in the air like a heavy fog, stinging the eyes, coating the lungs. People's voices grew hoarse and children coughed in their sleep, the sound mingling with the crackle of the fire. Some believed the smoke helped ward off illness or drove away fleas, but others whispered that it stole a bit of life with each breath. Yet no one dared let the fire die to avoid it, because without the smoke came darkness, and without the fire came death. On the coldest nights, even the fire seemed to tremble under the weight of winter. The wind would slip through the smallest crack in the shutters or under the door, and you could see it in the way the flames bent sideways, the embers flaring red before dimming again. The fire became a living thing you had to tend constantly, coaxing it like a sick child, adding fuel slowly, shielding it from drafts, stirring the coals just enough to keep the heat alive without smothering it. Falling asleep meant risking its death, so someone always stayed half awake, listening for the change in its sound. The silence of a dead fire was the most dangerous sound of all. For warmth, families would gather around it in a half circle before bed, hands stretched out until they tingled, feet placed as close as they could bear. They turned slowly, trying to warm every side of their body, but the heat was fleeting. By the time you turned away, the part of you that faced the cold air was already cooling again. This small ritual was as much psychological as physical, a moment of pretending you could store the heat in your skin, carry it with you under the blankets until morning. But everyone knew it wouldn't last. There were tricks to stretching the warmth through the night. Some wrapped heated stones in cloth and tucked them into bedding, hoping they would radiate heat long enough to make the first hours bearable. Others banked the fire before bed, covering the embers with ash to keep them alive until morning. If it worked, you could stir the coals at dawn and coax them back into flames without the agony of starting from scratch. But if it failed, you woke to a blackened hearth and the bitter work of rebuilding fire with frozen fingers. The fear of waking to a dead hearth was real. Without it, the cold became a predator that moved silently into every corner of the house. Breath turned to mist in the air. Frost formed along the inside of the walls, clinging to the rough wood and mud like a creeping bloom of ice. Water left in a bucket froze solid, and the air burned the lungs when you tried to breathe too deeply. In that silence, the absence of fire was a weight on the chest, a reminder that survival in winter was never guaranteed. And yet, there was a strange intimacy to the fire's presence. Families told stories around it, shared the last bits of food, mended clothes in its glow. The fire was more than heat. It was the heartbeat of the home, the one living thing that seemed to stand between them and the dark. They knew its moods, its hunger, its weakness. It could burn too fast and betray them, or burn too low and abandon them. And like any fragile ally, it demanded constant care, constant attention. Because the moment you turned your back for too long, it could vanish into the night, taking your last defense against the cold with it. And when that happened, when the final ember gave its last glow, there was no choice but to face the icy dark head-on, knowing that the battle for warmth would have to start all over again. Clothing in the medieval countryside was never about fashion. It was armor against the cold, even if that armor was thin, worn, and barely holding together. For a peasant, every layer mattered. Tunics were made from coarse wool that scratched the skin but held precious warmth, and they were worn until the fabric thinned to threads. Holes were patched with whatever scraps could be found, creating a patchwork of mismatched textures and colors. Some pieces had been mended so many times they were more stitches than original cloth, each repair telling a quiet story of winters survived. But no matter how carefully they were layered, the wind had a way of finding every gap. The idea of winter clothing was a luxury. Most peasants wore the same garments year-round, adding rags, shawls, or even old sacks when the temperature dropped. Thick, fur-lined coats were treasures only the wealthy could afford. Instead, people relied on layering. The thin undertunic, the heavier overtunic, and perhaps a cloak or cape if they were lucky. Even then, the cold seeped through. Scarves were made from strips of cloth wrapped around the head and neck, tied so tightly they left creases in the skin. Hats were often simple wool caps, pulled low to cover the ears. Though on the coldest nights, people slept with them on, hoping to trap as much heat as possible. Hands and feet were the hardest to protect. Mittens were a rare luxury. More often, peasants simply wrapped strips of cloth or worn-out pieces of fabric around their fingers, binding them in place with bits of string. These makeshift wrappings were stiff and awkward, and they quickly soaked through when handling snow or water. Boots were no better. Leather wore thin quickly, and many pairs were patched with layers of felt or stuffed with straw to fill the gaps and add insulation. The straw helped at first, but once it became damp from snow or sweat, it froze solid, turning each step into a cold, brittle crunch. And yet, removing it meant losing the only buffer between bare feet and the icy ground. Clothing wasn't washed often in winter, partly because water was scarce and partly because the drying process could take days. A wet garment hung near the fire might still be damp after a week, and the risk of wearing it before it was fully dry was too high. It could sap body heat and invite sickness. This meant that clothes were worn for weeks, sometimes months, without proper cleaning. The wool grew stiff with sweat, grease from cooking fires, and smoke from the hearth. The smell clung to everything, a mix of earth, ash, and human labor. But in the cold, odor didn't matter. Warmth was the only currency worth anything. For the poorest, layering sometimes meant nothing more than wearing every piece of cloth they owned, regardless of condition or fit. An old woman might walk the village wrapped in a faded tunic under a patched cloak, with a ragged blanket tied around her shoulders like a shawl. Children often wore clothes handed down so many times they no longer fit properly. Sleeves far too long, hems dragging in the mud, waistlines cinched with rope. And, while the extra layers helped, they couldn't stop the icy wind from sneaking in at the wrists, the ankles, the collar. That small invasion of cold felt harmless at first, but given hours in the open air, it could seep inward until even the thickest blanket couldn't chase it away. Some peasants swore by little tricks to add warmth: a heated stone tucked into a pocket, a pouch of warm ashes held in the hands, even strips of fur sewn inside clothing for added insulation. But these tricks were fragile, temporary. Stones cooled, ashes spilled, fur wore thin, and when you spent hours outside tending animals, chopping wood, or hauling water, the cold didn't just stay on your skin, it found its way into your muscles, into your bones, and once it was there, it was almost impossible to drive out. The nights were worse. By the time darkness fell, the day's labor had already worn through most of the body's heat reserves. Sitting down to rest meant feeling the cold crawl in deeper, curling around your legs, settling in your chest. The clothes that had been barely enough during daylight seemed to fail completely in the stillness of night. People would pull every scrap they had over themselves, wrapping and rewrapping, tugging cloaks over blankets, over tunics. Even then, there was always that sharp ache in the toes, that dull burn in the fingers, that sense that no matter how much you layered, the cold would always find a way. And it wasn't only about physical discomfort. In a medieval winter, poorly insulated clothing could be the thin line between life and death. Exposure could kill in hours if the wind was cruel enough, and frostbite was a constant danger. Blackened toes and fingers were not uncommon, and losing them meant losing the ability to work, an outcome as deadly as the cold itself. A peasant who couldn't work couldn't eat, and one missed harvest or one unpaid rent could lead to ruin. Every stitch in a sleeve, every scrap of cloth, was a form of protection, not just against the season, but against the spiral of survival itself collapsing. Even in the safety of the home, the cold clung to clothing. Wool layers kept on indoors became heavy with the dampness of breath and body heat, and yet removing them meant losing whatever insulation you'd fought to hold on to all day. People often slept fully dressed, boots still on, belts loosened but not removed. It wasn't comfort, it was strategy. Because in the heart of winter, every single layer could mean one more morning alive. And as they drifted to sleep under the weight of wool, straw, and rough fabric, there was always the silent hope that those layers would still be enough when the next night came. By the time night truly settled over a medieval village, the cold had already seeped into every surface, every wall, every breath. Darkness didn't just arrive. It pressed down on everything like a weight. The hours ahead were long, stretching endlessly between the dying light of the hearth and the faint hope of sunrise. For peasants, the night was not a time of peace. It was another battle, fought lying still under whatever protection they could manage. And in those silent hours, the cold seemed to grow stronger, almost as if it gained confidence when the world slept. The human body, after a full day of work in frigid air, had little energy left to produce heat. Muscles tired from chopping wood or tending animals could no longer shiver efficiently to keep the blood moving. Hands and feet, already stiff, grew numb, and with numbness came the danger of frostbite, even indoors. The mind, dulled by exhaustion, drifted between wakefulness and sleep. It was always aware of the cold gnawing at the edges of consciousness. Some would wake in the middle of the night, not from a sound, but from the sharp bite of icy air on an exposed hand or cheek. That simple shock was enough to remind them the night could take you if you let your guard down. The hours before dawn were the most dangerous. Fires, banked low to conserve fuel, lost their heat. Blankets, once warm with shared body heat, grew colder as the night dragged on. The air felt heavier, sharper, biting at the lungs with each inhale. In this pre-dawn chill, the body's temperature naturally dropped, making it even harder to keep warm. Those with weak health often slipped away during these hours, their breathing slowing until it simply stopped. Survivors would find them still wrapped in their covers, as if sleeping, proof of how quietly the cold could claim a life. Every sound in the dark seemed louder in winter. The snap of wood settling, the sigh of the wind through cracks in the shutters, the faint rustle of straw beneath shifting bodies. All of it felt amplified. For some, it was comforting, a reminder they were not alone. For others, it was unnerving, the sense that the night itself was alive and watching. Outside, wolves might howl from the forest, their cries carrying for miles in the still air. Dogs barked in response, then fell silent, as if remembering the futility of challenging the cold. The world beyond the walls was a frozen expanse where only predators thrived. Sleep was rarely uninterrupted. People shifted constantly, trying to find pockets of warmth within their bedding. pressing closer to those beside them, tucking hands and feet into shared spaces. Children often clung to their parents in their sleep, their small bodies radiating what little heat they had left. Parents, in turn, wrapped arms around them protectively, not just for comfort, but to monitor their breathing, to make sure the cold hadn't stolen their strength. It was an unspoken rule. Wake if you feel them grow too still. Before we go any further, make sure you're subscribed and give this video a thumbs up so we can keep exploring history together. I want to know, what's the time in your city right now and which part of the world are you joining us from? Some families developed rituals to survive the night. They might take turns waking to stir the fire, even if it meant stepping barefoot onto the freezing floor. Others would sleep in shifts, so someone was always awake to listen for trouble, whether it was the wind threatening to tear a shutter loose or the faint hiss of snow blowing through a gap in the wall. In a world where homes were fragile and weather was merciless, a small problem at night could become a catastrophe before morning. The cold also shaped dreams. People often spoke of vivid, unsettling visions during winter nights. Dreams of being chased, of wandering through endless snow, of searching for warmth that was always just out of reach. Some believed these dreams were warnings from the spirit of winter itself, testing their will to survive. Others saw them as omens, especially if someone fell ill soon after. In a time when superstition and survival were intertwined, even a dream could alter the mood of a household. And then there was the strange, fragile hope of morning. As the black sky began to pale even slightly, people stirred beneath their covers. It wasn't the sun that woke them. It was the shift in the air, the faint promise that the worst hours had passed. The cold was still there, sharp and merciless, but the knowledge that light was returning gave them a spark of energy. The first rays of dawn filtered weakly through the shutters, catching on the frost that had formed on the inside of the walls. It was beautiful in a cruel way, like a reminder of how close they had come to freezing where they lay. But there was no time to linger in the relief of survival. The fire had to be fed, the animals tended, the day's work begun, all while carrying the fatigue of another night endured rather than slept through. The warmth of morning, such as it was, would not last, and the cold would return with the setting sun. Each night was a cycle of preparation, endurance, and relief, repeated over and over until the season finally broke. And deep down, every peasant knew that as long as winter ruled, the cold was never truly gone. It was simply waiting for its next chance. For peasants, work did not stop for winter. The cold was never an excuse. It was a condition of life. When the first light of day crept into the single-room home, the day's labor began, no matter how frozen the air felt on their skin. Stepping outside in the early hours was like crossing a threshold into another world, one where every breath stung and every sound seemed sharper. The earth was hard as stone, each step crunching through frost or packed snow. But there was wood to gather, animals to feed, and countless small tasks that could not be delayed, because in a medieval winter, a single neglected chore could lead to disaster. Chopping wood was one of the first duties. It was brutal work in summer, but in winter it became a test of endurance. The axe handle, cold enough to burn bare skin, had to be gripped through thick, stiff gloves or wrapped rags. Splitting frozen logs required more strength than usual, the fibers rigid with ice. Each strike sent a shiver up the arms and into the shoulders, yet without enough wood, the fire inside would fade, and everything else, the blankets, the clothing, the huddling, would be useless. The pile had to be kept high, even if it meant working until fingers were numb and the breath came out in ragged clouds. Feeding the animals was another daily trial. Most peasants kept goats, chickens, or a pig or two, and their survival was as vital as the family's own. Livestock meant milk, eggs, meat, life itself in a season when the earth gave nothing. But tending them in winter was treacherous. Water froze solid in buckets and troughs overnight, needing to be broken open with whatever tool was at hand. Feed had to be carried from storage, often through knee-deep snow, the wind cutting across open ground. The animals huddled together for warmth in their pens, their breath steaming in the cold air. They were as dependent on the peasants as the peasants were on them, and neglecting them even for a day could mean losing everything they provided. Gathering water was a task that could not be postponed. If a village well was available, it meant trudging through the cold with empty buckets, pulling up icy water by rope and hauling it home while trying not to spill a drop. If the well was frozen, the only option might be breaking ice on a nearby stream or melting snow over the fire. Snow, however, yielded far less water than it appeared to, and melting it meant sacrificing valuable fuel. Every sip had a cost, whether measured in labor or in precious wood. Even the simplest repairs became grueling in the cold. A broken shutter had to be fixed before the wind could tear it open entirely. A leaking roof had to be patched before snow could soak the bedding. But working with bare fingers was dangerous. They stiffened quickly, and the pain could become unbearable in minutes. Still, leaving a task unfinished was not an option. The cold punished weakness, and any gap in the home's defenses became an open invitation for it to creep in. Food preparation was no less challenging. Root vegetables stored in cellars grew soft or sprouted. Grain had to be ground into flour in freezing air, and meat, if there was any, had to be thawed before cooking. Women worked over the hearth with their hands wrapped in cloth, stirring pots of thin soup while smoke curled into their eyes. Every meal was an act of preservation, stretching supplies as far as possible. Sometimes, the only thing for dinner was a porridge made from grain and water, flavored with a pinch of salt if there was any left. It filled the stomach, but barely warmed the body. And yet, despite the relentless labor, there was a rhythm to it that kept people moving. Tasks had to be done in a certain order, not because anyone had the luxury of routine, but because survival demanded efficiency. If the woodpile was low, it was replenished first. If the animals were restless, they were fed before the family ate. If the roof sagged under snow, it was cleared before another storm could make it collapse. Each decision carried the weight of the coming night, when mistakes could no longer be fixed. The body adapted in strange ways. Fingers developed a kind of dull resilience to the cold. Muscles learned to keep working even when stiff. But adaptation didn't mean comfort. It meant enduring. Each moment outside was a negotiation between finishing the job and protecting the body from damage. A hand kept too long on the axe handle might lose feeling for hours. A foot in a wet boot could become a dangerous liability by sunset. And as the day drew on, the work never truly ended. The cold made every task take longer, every step feel heavier. Even returning indoors didn't bring full relief. The air inside was warmer, but still far from cozy. Clothes stayed damp, muscles stayed tight, and the knowledge lingered that tomorrow would bring the same demands. Yet there was no thought of stopping. In the medieval countryside, winter didn't pause for fatigue. It pressed forward, and so did the peasants, one task at a time, one breath at a time, holding out until the fragile light of day began to fade, and the cold of night came calling again. Animals were never just animals in a medieval peasant's home during winter. They were heaters, guardians, and in some cases, lifelines. Letting them sleep inside wasn't an act of affection. It was a survival strategy born out of necessity. Goats, sheep, and even chickens could radiate enough warmth to slightly raise the temperature in a single-room dwelling, making the difference between enduring a bitter night and facing frostbite before dawn. The smells, the noise, and the mess were secondary concerns when the air outside could kill. In the logic of survival, a goat's breath steaming beside the hearth was far preferable to the creeping frost that would settle without it. Bringing animals inside was not a simple matter of letting them wander in. There was an order to it, a kind of hierarchy of warmth. The most valuable livestock, the ones that provided milk, eggs, or wool, were given space closer to the hearth or sleeping area. Less productive animals might be kept near the door, where the air was colder and drafts were stronger. Chickens often roosted in baskets or low wooden racks, their feathers puffed out as they dozed, occasionally startling the sleepers with sudden clucks in the dark. Sheep and goats were usually tied to keep them from wandering or nibbling at whatever they could find, but their shifting bodies and quiet bleats were constant reminders of the strange companionship winter demanded. Of course, sharing space with animals brought its own problems. Bedding straw had to be replaced more often, or the air would become thick with the smell of manure and damp wool. Flies were fewer in winter, but fleas and lice did not vanish. They adapted, finding new hosts among the humans when the opportunity arose. Still, the trade was worth it. The warmth from a living creature was immediate and constant, a heat that didn't require precious firewood or risk burning out in the middle of the night. For children, sleeping beside a goat or a dog was almost like sharing a blanket. They would curl up against the animal's side, feeling the steady rhythm of its breathing, the solid warmth of its body. Parents encouraged it, not just for comfort, but because they knew it could keep a child's temperature just high enough to make it through the coldest hours. Sometimes, even the smallest animals, like a clutch of rabbits kept in a woven pen, were brought inside for this purpose. Their combined warmth added up, and in winter, every small degree mattered. In the stillness of night, the sounds of the animals became part of the household's heartbeat. The low shuffle of hooves on the floor, the soft rustle of feathers, the faint crunch of hay being chewed. All these noises were signs of life, proof that the little world inside those walls was still holding together against the vast cold beyond them. It was a strange kind of comfort, knowing that survival was being fought not just by the humans, but by every living thing in the room. However, living this closely with animals also meant a blending of rhythms. When the rooster crowed at first light, there was no ignoring it. Sleep ended abruptly, replaced by the urgent work of feeding and watering the livestock before tending to human needs. On especially harsh mornings, water would freeze solid in the buckets inside the house, forcing peasants to break the ice before giving it to the animals. Feed was brought in from storage, often damp with frost, and spread out carefully to avoid waste. Hungry animals were restless animals, and in the cramped space of a winter home, restlessness could lead to chaos, overturned pots, broken tools, or in rare cases, injury. There was also the constant tension of scarcity. The hay stored for winter had to be rationed carefully, not just to last until spring, but to keep it dry and usable. A spoiled bale was worse than useless. It could make animals sick, and if an animal fell ill in winter, there was often little that could be done. There were no warm barns, no veterinarians, and few remedies beyond herbal concoctions or whispered prayers. Losing a cow or a goat in the heart of winter wasn't just a personal tragedy. It could mean less milk for children, fewer hides for clothing, less manure for spring planting. Yet for all the hardship, there was an undeniable bond forged in these months of shared struggle. Families came to know the personalities of their animals in intimate detail. The goat that stood guard near the door as if protecting everyone inside, the hen that insisted on roosting near the fire, the sheep that leaned against people for warmth. These small relationships blurred the line between necessity and affection. A pig might still be slaughtered when the season demanded it, but until that day, it was part of the household, contributing to the fragile network of survival. The practice of keeping animals indoors during winter was not without its critics, even at the time. Some claimed it spread disease, that it was unclean, that it blurred the natural order. But for those living in the brutal reality of a medieval winter, such arguments sounded hollow. Warmth was not a luxury. It was the difference between seeing another sunrise or not, and if that warmth came from the steady body heat of a goat lying beside the hearth, then it was embraced without shame. As the winter nights dragged on, the mingled breath of humans and animals would cloud the air, a visible testament to the fact that life still pulsed inside those walls. And when the howling wind rattled the shutters and the frost thickened on the windows, there was a quiet, unspoken truth that everyone in that cramped, smoky room understood. Survival was a shared burden, and in the battle against the cold, every heartbeat counted. Illness in winter was more than a misfortune for a medieval peasant. It was a quiet threat that could grow from a whisper to a death sentence in a matter of days. The cold months were a perfect trap for disease. People lived crammed into single rooms, breathing the same smoky air, sharing the same bedding, passing around the same wooden cups. One cough in the night could carry to every ear, a sharp, dry sound that made even the healthiest pause and wonder if it would spread. There was no understanding of bacteria or viruses, but everyone knew that when someone started coughing in winter, the whole household was at risk. Pneumonia was one of the deadliest. What began as a mild chill, shivers, a bit of fatigue, could turn into a racking cough and fever that drained all strength. Without proper medicine, there was little to do except keep the sufferer warm and pray the fever would break. Sometimes herbal remedies were brewed. Hot infusions of thyme, mint, or chamomile, steeped in smoky water and sweetened with precious honey if any remained. They might ease the symptoms, but often they were too little, too late. The sick lay wrapped in blankets, their breath visible in the cold air, the sound of their labored breathing filling the silence between the crackles of the hearth. Children were especially vulnerable. Their small bodies lost heat quickly, and once fever set in, it could burn through them like a wildfire. Mothers would press their hands to a child's forehead, feeling the unnatural heat and knowing in the pit of their stomach that they might be powerless to stop it. In some homes, children were wrapped in layers and placed closest to the fire, even if it meant the rest of the family slept in the colder parts of the room. Survival was not shared equally. Sometimes the youngest were shielded at the expense of the strong. Colds and fevers were common, but winter also brought stranger, more mysterious ailments. People complained of pains in their joints, strange rashes, or sudden weakness that left them unable to stand. Some blamed bad air, others pointed to the smoke that filled their lungs night after night. Malnutrition played its part too. Meals in winter were small, repetitive, and lacking in variety. Without enough fresh vegetables or meat, the body weakened, and wounds that would heal in summer lingered and festered. Infection was a slow predator, creeping deeper into the flesh until it was too late to fight. There was no real concept of quarantine. The sick slept alongside the healthy, because there was nowhere else for them to go. If a bed was vacated by death, it was soon occupied by someone else. Warmth was too precious to leave unused. In this way, sickness spread invisibly, passing from one person to the next. When it took hold of a household, the work of survival became almost impossible. Wood wasn't chopped, animals went hungry, and the fire burned lower. The cold seemed to sense weakness and press in harder. Superstition and faith were intertwined with every attempt at healing. Some swore by charms. A sprig of rosemary hung above the bed, a small cross tied with thread to a wrist, a whispered blessing spoken over a cup of water. Others turned to the village healer, who would mix strange brews of herbs, animal fat, and even ashes, rubbing them into the skin or making the patient drink. Whether these worked or not was often irrelevant. Belief itself could give the sick the will to hold on one more night, and sometimes that will was enough to tip the balance. Death from illness in winter carried its own cruel logistics. The frozen ground was hard to dig, and families often delayed burial until the earth could be broken. In the meantime, the body might be kept outside in the cold, wrapped in cloth, both preserved and abandoned at the same time. The sight of it, silent and still, lying beneath the pale winter sky, was a reminder of how close the living stood to the same fate. The presence of the dead in the yard was not morbid to them, it was simply another fact of winter. Yet, for all its dangers, illness in winter also revealed the resilience of those who endured it. Families rallied around the sick, keeping the fire burning longer, sacrificing food to make warm broth, watching through the night for any sign of change. Neighbors might bring small gifts, a handful of herbs, a little extra wood, because they knew that the same kindness might one day be returned when their turn came. Survival was a collective act, even in sickness. Still, there was always that quiet dread each time someone coughed or shivered. The question lingered in the air like frost on the windows. Would they see the spring, or would the cold and the sickness decide otherwise? And as the winter dragged on, that question hung over every household, waiting for its answer. The medieval winter night was not just cold, it was long, and in its length it could wear down even the strongest will. For peasants, there was no clock to mark the passing hours, only the slow rhythm of the body's discomfort and the subtle changes in the fire's glow. The blackness outside was complete, with no street lamps or distant lights to break it. Once the shutters were closed, the world beyond the walls might as well have ceased to exist. The only reality was the small, smoky room, the creak of the wooden beams in the wind, and the breath of those lying beside you. In that stillness, the mind wandered to places the body couldn't go. Some stared into the faint flicker of embers, imagining the next day's work, while others lay awake in uneasy half-sleep, listening for sounds that didn't belong. A scratch at the door could be a loose branch in the wind, or it could be something else. In a time when wolves still roamed the forests and thieves might creep into a village under cover of darkness, the night was never entirely trusted. Even the wind had a voice, one that seemed to carry whispers if you listened too long. Cold has a way of sharpening the senses. In the dark, every small sound, the shifting of straw under a sleeping body, the faint drip of water from a roof beam, the muted thump of snow sliding off the roof, felt magnified. For children, it was a source of fear. For adults, it was a reminder to stay alert. A loosened shutter could let in more than just a draft. And yet, the cold outside was so fierce that even the boldest avoided venturing out unless absolutely necessary. The risk was not only in what might be waiting, but in the way the night air could rob you of strength within minutes. The darkest hours came just before dawn, when the fire had burned low, the blankets had cooled, and the body's temperature naturally dipped. It was during these hours that the cold seemed most alive, as if it pressed harder against the walls, probing for weakness. Breath fogged the air in front of your face, hanging there for a moment before fading into the dimness. The frost that had crept along the edges of the window frames earlier in the night now reached farther in, tracing patterns on the walls themselves. It was as if winter were trying to claim the inside of the house inch by inch. Surviving these hours was about more than warmth. It was about endurance. People shifted under their blankets to keep blood moving, pressing closer together, pulling cloaks tighter. Parents checked their children's breathing in the dark, reaching out to feel the rise and fall of a chest, reassured by the steady rhythm. In some homes, someone would rise to stir the fire, though the act of leaving the bed was a battle in itself. The shock of stepping onto the frozen floorboards could send pain shooting through the feet, and every second spent away from the bedding risked losing precious heat. Yet letting the fire die completely meant facing the next hours without any defense. When the first hint of light finally bled into the room, it was never sudden or dramatic. It came as a faint softening of the darkness, a gray haze filtering through the shutters. Eyes accustomed to the gloom noticed it immediately, and the shift stirred people from their half-sleep. The relief was real, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the day ahead would be just as cold as the night had been. Rising from the bedding was slow work, each movement careful, as if breaking away from a fragile cocoon. Limbs stiff from the cold protested with every bend and stretch. Morning routines were dictated by necessity. The fire had to be rebuilt before anything else. No one could work, eat, or even think clearly without it. A few coals, still glowing faintly, could be coaxed into flames if treated with patience. If the hearth was dead, the process began from scratch, with flint and steel, and it could take long, frustrating minutes to spark life into the tinder. All the while the cold clung to the room, lingering in the corners, wrapping itself around bare skin like a damp cloth. Once the fire caught, the first sounds of the day began. The pop of kindling, the rustle of blankets being folded back, the muted coughs of sleepers waking fully. But no one forgot the hours that had just passed. They were carried into the day like a weight, a reminder that night would come again soon, and with it, another round of endurance. Every action taken in the daylight, from chopping wood to mending clothes, was a preparation for facing that darkness again. And so, in the medieval winter, morning was not a victory in itself. It was a brief reprieve, a fragile truce in the ongoing fight between warmth and cold. The sun might rise, but it never rose, high enough to banish winter's grip. The peasants knew this in their bones. Dawn was only the start of another countdown, to the next sunset, the next long night, the next test of who would see the morning after. Superstition was woven into the fabric of medieval winter life, as present in the cold air as the smoke from the hearth. In a world where science was unknown to most, explanations for hardship were shaped by faith, fear, and generations of whispered belief. The cold itself was not merely weather. It was a living force in the minds of many, a spirit or a curse sent to test the endurance of the body and the soul. People gave it names, treated it as an entity that had to be respected, feared, and occasionally appeased. It was easier to survive when you believed there was a reason for the suffering, even if that reason lived in the realm of the unseen. Amulets were a common shield against the winter's invisible dangers. Some peasants tied sprigs of rosemary or juniper above the door, believing they would ward off evil spirits that roamed more freely in the long nights. Others wore small pouches of herbs or charms carved from bone around their necks. These talismans were often passed down through families, the leather worn smooth by decades of use. Whether they truly protected against illness or misfortune didn't matter. What mattered was the comfort they brought, the sense that you were not entirely defenseless against forces you couldn't see. Prayers and blessings were another layer of protection, and they were often repeated at the threshold of the home each evening before the shutters were closed. The words were murmured quietly, sometimes in Latin, phrases barely understood by those speaking them, sometimes in the local tongue, invoking saints, angels, or ancestral spirits. In some villages, it was believed that failing to bless the home before nightfall invited misfortune, as though the darkness outside would notice the absence and slip in more easily. Superstition also shaped behavior inside the home. Some refused to whistle or sing after dark, fearing it would draw unwanted attention from wandering spirits. Others believed it was unlucky to mend clothing at night. It was said that stitching in the dark could sow death into the family. There were rules about where you could sleep in relation to the door, about keeping iron tools near the bed to repel evil, about never leaving a broom lying across the doorway lest it invite sickness. These customs might seem strange now, but in the bitter stillness of a medieval winter, they were lines drawn against the unknown. There were also seasonal rituals meant to guard against the dangers of cold months. In some places, the first snowfall was greeted with a small offering, bread left on the windowsill, a splash of ale poured onto the ground, to honor the spirit of winter and ask for mercy. A few families burned certain herbs in the hearth not only for their scent, but because they believed the smoke would keep away the malice that crept in during the long nights. The line between practical and mystical blurred easily. A warm fire and a blessing over it served the same purpose in the minds of those who lived by these traditions. When sickness struck during winter, superstition often dictated the cure. A fever might be treated by tying a red thread around the wrist, or by placing a silver coin under the tongue while reciting a prayer. Coughs were chased away with mixtures of honey and crushed garlic, not only for their supposed medicinal properties, but because they were believed to drive out the evil cold inhabiting the body. These treatments were not entirely without effect. Garlic and honey do have antibacterial qualities, but their strength in the medieval mind came from the belief behind them. The fear of omens was particularly strong in winter. A bird flying into the house was seen as a warning. A crack in the ice too near the shore was a sign of approaching death, and dreams of snow falling endlessly were thought to predict illness. People read meaning into everything, because in a season where survival was uncertain, being prepared, even for imagined dangers, was a form of control. Some would change their behavior entirely based on such signs, avoiding travel, postponing work, or sleeping in a different part of the house to avoid whatever fate the omen suggested. In the rare moments when the weather broke and the sun shone, there were rituals for gratitude as well. Families might open their shutters to let in the light, scattering a pinch of salt on the doorstep to seal in the warmth. Neighbors would sometimes visit each other on these days, exchanging small gifts, bundles of herbs, bits of preserved meat, as if to remind themselves that community was a shield as powerful as any charm. But superstition could also bring tension. If misfortune struck, an illness, a death, a sudden loss of livestock, people looked for causes beyond the natural. Whispers could start, pointing to a neighbor who had skipped a blessing, or to a widow who had refused to share her bread. Accusations of witchcraft were not common in every village, but the seeds of suspicion were always there, waiting for the cold and fear to make them grow. Trust was a fragile thing in the dark of winter, and superstition was both a comfort and a weapon. For the peasants who lived through those months, these beliefs were not quaint traditions. They were part of the structure holding life together. Whether or not the charms worked, whether the prayers truly kept danger at bay, they gave meaning to hardship and shaped the rhythm of survival. And when the wind howled outside and the frost crept across the inside of the shutters, it was easier to face the night believing you had done something, anything, to hold the darkness at bay. Because in that world, the line between the cold outside and the cold that could take root inside the soul felt far too thin. Dawn in a medieval winter was not the triumphant blaze of light we might imagine. It was a slow, reluctant unveiling, as if the sun itself was hesitant to return to such a bitter world. The first hints of morning were often gray rather than golden, filtering through warped shutters and frost-covered gaps in the walls. Inside, the air was still icy, heavy with the smell of smoke, damp wool, and the lingering breath of people and animals who had shared the same stale space through the long night. Survival through those hours brought a quiet relief, but it was a relief tempered by the knowledge that the day ahead would demand just as much strength as the night had. The first task was always the fire. If someone had successfully banked the embers before sleep, There might still be a faint glow beneath the ash, ready to be coaxed into life with kindling and breath. But if the hearth was dead, starting anew meant flint and steel, scraping sparks into a nest of dry fibers, if such fibers could be found in the damp chill. It was a process that required patience, steady hands, and the ability to ignore the numbing cold that clawed at the fingers. Those first flames were more than heat. They were a signal that the household had a fighting chance to meet the day. Once the fire was burning, light followed. Shutters were opened cautiously, letting in a thin wash of pale sun, or, more often, a white glare reflecting off the snow. Sometimes the brightness outside was deceptive. The air that came rushing in was sharper than a blade, and the act of letting in the light also let in the cold. Still, the day had to begin. The warmth of bed, meager as it was, could not compete with the urgency of the tasks waiting beyond the threshold. The morning meal was usually little more than a continuation of whatever had been left from the night before: thin porridge, a crust of bread, perhaps a ladle of broth. The goal was not indulgence, but fuel, enough to keep muscles working through the freezing hours ahead. Eating was often done in silence, each person mentally preparing for the labor that awaited. Every member of the household had a role to play, and no one was exempt. Even the youngest might be sent to fetch water, a chore that could mean walking over slippery, frozen ground with heavy wooden buckets that bit into small hands. Water was never simple in winter. Wells could ice over, requiring force to break through the surface, and streams might be locked beneath a crust of snow and frost. Carrying water back to the home was a race against the elements. It had to be used quickly or stored carefully to prevent it from freezing solid before the day was done. Any spill was costly, and every drop mattered, because melting snow indoors consumed valuable firewood. The animals had to be tended before the humans could turn to other work. Livestock stirred restlessly as the light grew, their hunger and thirst just as pressing as any human need. Ice had to be chipped from troughs, feed spread out, and bedding replaced to keep them alive and productive. The steam rising from their bodies in the frosty air was a visible reminder of why they were so carefully guarded during the night. Their warmth, their milk, their eggs could mean the difference between a household that endured and one that starved. With the animals settled, the larger outdoor tasks began. Snow might need to be shoveled from paths to prevent accidents or to reach storage sheds. Wood piles were inspected and replenished, sometimes requiring trips into the forest to gather more, a dangerous undertaking when the cold was at its most intense. The forest, in winter, was both a lifeline and a hazard. It could provide the fuel to keep the hearth alive, but it could also swallow a person whole if they misstepped into deep snow or wandered too far in low visibility. Even small repairs demanded immediate attention. A sagging roof beam heavy with snow or a draft creeping in through a loosened shutter could not be ignored. Winter punished neglect without mercy, and any weakness in the home's defenses could turn into a catastrophe overnight. Men and women worked side by side to keep the structure sound, often using whatever crude tools were available, their hands growing stiff and red in the cold. As the day wore on, the cold never truly lifted. Even in full daylight, breath hung in the air like smoke, and every task carried the awareness that the sun's arc was short. There were only a few precious hours to gather resources, finish repairs, and prepare food before the light began to fade again. Each movement was a quiet race against time, because once darkness returned, the rhythm of survival would reset. Seal the house, feed the fire, huddle close, and endure. But there was also something else that morning brought, a fragile thread of hope. The fact that you had seen the light again meant that you had won another round against the night. The day's challenges were relentless, but they were at least familiar, tangible. The true enemy, the deep, paralyzing cold of the small hours, was gone for now, lingering beyond the horizon, waiting for its chance to creep back in. And as peasants moved through their morning tasks, they carried the unspoken knowledge that every stroke of the axe, every trip to the well, every careful handful of grain was not just for the day's survival, but for the inevitable night that would come again.